February 14, 1945. Camp Perry, Ohio. The transport truck lurches to a stop, and Greta Hoffman feels her stomach drop as the canvas flap pulls back, revealing a sprawling compound of wooden barracks stretching across snow-dusted fields. The cold air hits her face, sharp and clean, so different from the acrid smoke and aviation fuel that had filled her lungs for the past 3 years at the Luftwaffe maintenance depot outside Berlin. She's 24 years old, a skilled aircraft mechanic, and now a prisoner of war on American soil. Her hands, hidden in the pockets of her threadbare Luftwaffe-issue jacket, throb with their familiar ache. The scars across her palms feel tight in the cold, the fingertips on her left hand still numb from frostbite that never properly healed. She flexes them carefully, wincing at the stiffness that has become as much a part of her as her own bones. Around her, 30 other German women climb down from the truck, their faces pale and drawn, eyes scanning the camp with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Most are Luftwaffe auxiliaries like herself, a few Wehrmacht signals operators, 1 or 2 nurses. They had surrendered together in the chaotic final weeks as the Reich crumbled, processed through a facility in France before the long Atlantic crossing. Greta had expected many things during that voyage. She expected to be shot, perhaps, or worked to death in some American factory as retribution. She expected starvation, certainly. Everyone knew what happened to prisoners. Her own government had made that abundantly clear in their warnings about the barbaric Americans who would torture captured Germans. But standing now in this Ohio camp, breathing air that smells of pine trees and distant wood smoke instead of cordite and death, she feels only a strange, disorienting uncertainty. An American sergeant approaches, a woman in an olive-drab uniform with corporal stripes on her sleeve. She's perhaps 30, with dark hair pinned neatly under her cap, and she addresses them in accented but functional German. "Welcome to Camp Perry. You will be processed, assigned barracks, and given work details. Follow the rules and you will be treated fairly." The words sound almost absurd. Treated fairly. Greta wants to laugh, but her throat feels too tight. Nothing has been fair for so long that she's forgotten what the word even means. The processing takes 2 hours. They surrender what few possessions they still carry. Greta hands over a small photograph of her mother, a broken pocket watch that had belonged to her father, and a stub of pencil she'd managed to keep hidden. An American clerk catalogs each item carefully, writing everything down in a ledger, promising they'll be returned when she's eventually released. Released. As if that day will actually come. As if any of them will survive long enough to see it. They're issued prison uniforms, rough cotton dyed a dull gray blue, and led to a barracks that smells of fresh wood and disinfectant. 30 metal frame beds line the walls, each with a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. A pillow. Greta stares at it as if it might be a hallucination. For the past 6 months, she'd slept on a wooden bench in the maintenance hangar when she slept at all, using her jacket as a cushion. The other women move through the barracks in stunned silence, touching the blankets tentatively, sitting on the beds as if testing whether they're real. Someone starts crying quietly, and the sound spreads like a contagion until half the women are weeping, though none of them could say exactly why. Exhaustion, perhaps. Relief. The sheer cognitive dissonance of being treated like human beings after so long. As evening approaches, they're called to the mess hall. The building is warm, heated by radiators that clank and hiss, and the smell of food, actual food, makes Greta's knees weak. They're served beef stew, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, alongside bread that's soft and white, nothing like the sawdust-laced rations they'd choked down in Germany. There's butter, Real butter, yellow and creamy. Greta spreads it on her bread with shaking hands, and when she takes the first bite, the taste is so rich, so overwhelmingly good that tears stream down her face. She's not alone. All around her, women are crying as they eat, shoveling food into their mouths while sobbing, the sounds of grief and desperate hunger mingling in the warm air. An American guard stands near the door, a young man who can't be more than 20, and he looks away, his jaw tight, as if the sight of their breakdown makes him uncomfortable. After the meal, a captain addresses them through an interpreter. Tomorrow, work assignments will be posted. Those with mechanical skills will be assigned to the camp workshops. Those with clerical experience will work in the administrative offices. Everyone will work, but everyone will also be paid a small wage in camp scrip, usable at the canteen for personal items. Paid. The word doesn't make sense. Prisoners aren't paid. Prisoners are worked until they collapse, then replaced. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. But the captain continues, explaining rules and expectations in a tone that's firm but not cruel, and Greta feels reality tilting around her, nothing quite fitting the framework she'd built in her mind. That night, lying in an actual bed under wool blankets, she can't sleep. Her hands throb worse than usual, the warmth of the barracks making the damaged nerves flare with phantom sensations. She flexes her fingers in the darkness, feeling the familiar pull of scar tissue, the stiffness in the joints. 3 years. 3 years of wrapping her hands in whatever fabric scraps she could find, torn strips of old uniforms or rags stolen from the cleaning supplies, winding them around her palms and fingers before each shift in the freezing hangar. 3 years of handling metal tools so cold they burned, of gripping wrenches and screwdrivers with hands that had long since lost most of their feeling. The work had been brutal. Aircraft maintenance in winter, in hangars with no heat, with equipment that was always breaking down and parts that never arrived. She'd learned to work through the pain, through the blood that would seep through her makeshift wrappings when a sharp edge caught her palm or a tool slipped and gashed her thumb. She'd learned to hide the injuries because showing weakness meant reassignment, and reassignment meant the factories, and everyone knew the factories were death sentences. Her supervisor, Hauptmann Dietrich, had been clear about priorities. Gloves are for pilots, he'd said, his voice sharp with contempt when she'd once dared to ask. Pilots need sensitivity in their hands for the controls. You're just turning wrenches. Use rags like everyone else. Stop being soft. So she had. They all had. The entire maintenance crew, men and women alike, working with frozen hands wrapped in fabric that did almost nothing against the cold. She'd watched fingers turn white, then gray, then black. She'd seen 2 men lose fingers to frostbite, the digits simply falling off one morning like rotten fruit. She'd been lucky, she supposed. Her frostbite had been less severe. Just the numbness, the constant ache, the scars that crisscrossed her palms like a map of her service. Just the knowledge that her hands would never work quite right again, that she'd carry this damage for the rest of her life. It had seemed normal. That was the strangest part looking back. It had seemed like the natural order of things, the necessary sacrifice for the war effort. Everyone suffered. Everyone sacrificed. That's what made them strong, made them worthy. Comfort was weakness. Protection was coddling. Real Germans endured. She'd believed it. God help her, she'd believed it. The next morning, February 15th, work assignments are posted on a board outside the mess hall. Greta finds her name listed under Workshop 3, Mechanical Repair. She reports after breakfast, following a guard across the compound to a large wooden building that smells of machine oil and sawdust. Inside, the workshop is warm, heated by a potbelly stove in the corner, and lined with workbenches and tool racks. A dozen other prisoners are already there, men and women both, Germans and a few Italians, all wearing the same gray-blue uniforms. An American sergeant, a barrel-chested man in his 40s with grease stains on his hands, explains their duties. They'll be repairing equipment for the camp, maintaining vehicles, fixing broken tools and machinery. Basic work, nothing sensitive but skilled labor nonetheless. He speaks through an interpreter, his tone businesslike but not unkind. Then he moves to a cabinet and begins pulling out items: work aprons, safety goggles, and gloves. Leather work gloves, genuine leather, thick and sturdy with reinforced palms and fingers. He distributes them to each prisoner, checking sizes, exchanging pairs that don't fit properly. When he reaches Greta, he hands her a pair and gestures for her to try them on. She stares at the gloves in her hands. They're beautiful. The leather is supple, well-made, the kind of quality she hasn't seen in years. The kind of thing that would have been reserved for officers, for important people, for anyone but her. Her hands shake as she pulls them on. The left glove catches on her stiff fingers, and she has to work it carefully over the scar tissue. The fit is snug but not tight, and the moment her damaged hands settle into the soft leather interior, something inside her chest cracks. The sergeant is saying something, explaining that the gloves are theirs to keep, that they should wear them whenever working with tools or machinery, that there are spare pairs if these wear out. The interpreter translates, but Greta barely hears. She's staring at her hands, at these gloves that have been given to her as if she's worth protecting, as if her safety matters, as if she's something more than a disposable tool herself. She thinks of Hauptmann Dietrich, of his contempt, of the way he'd looked at her bleeding hands with nothing but irritation at the time she'd waste bandaging them. She thinks of the pilots who'd strutted through the hangar in their leather jackets and fur-lined gloves, while the mechanics worked with frozen, wrapped hands just meters away. She thinks of the propaganda posters that had covered every wall, exhorting them to sacrifice everything for victory, to endure any hardship, to prove their worth through suffering. And here, in an enemy camp, in the country she'd been taught to hate and fear, someone has handed her gloves as if it's the most natural thing in the world, as if preventing injury is simply common sense. The sergeant moves on to the next prisoner and Greta stands frozen, her vision blurring. The workshop continues around her, people moving to their assigned stations, tools being selected, work beginning. But she can't move. She can't breathe. The gloves on her hands feel impossibly heavy, weighted with a significance she can't fully process. A voice speaks beside her in German and she startles. It's a medic, a young American man with a Red Cross armband, and he's looking at her with concern. He gestures to her hands, asking something, and the interpreter hurries over. He wants to know if the gloves fit properly, the interpreter explains. He noticed you were having trouble with the left one. Without thinking, Greta pulls off the gloves. Her hands are exposed in the workshop light, and she sees the medic's expression change. He's looking at her palms, at the network of scars, at the stiff, slightly twisted fingers on her left hand, at the patches of skin that are still discolored from frostbite. He says something sharp, urgent, and gestures for her to follow him to a corner of the workshop where he's set up a small medical station. She goes numbly, not sure what else to do. He sits her down on a stool and takes her hands in his, turning them gently, examining the damage with a careful, professional eye. His touch is impersonal but kind, and he makes small sounds of dismay as he catalogues the injuries. Old frostbite, he says through the interpreter, multiple lacerations poorly healed, Nerve damage, probably permanent in some areas. Why weren't these treated? The question is so absurd that Greta almost laughs. Treated? With what? By whom? There had been no treatment, no medical care for something as trivial as damaged hands. There had barely been medical care for the dying. You worked until you couldn't, and then you were replaced. That was the system. That was how things were. She tries to explain this, her German coming in halting fragments, but the words sound insane even to her own ears. The medic listens, his expression growing darker, and then he shakes his head and reaches for his kit. He pulls out a tin of ointment, something that smells of camphor and herbs, and begins applying it to her hands with gentle, methodical care. He works the salve into her palms, into the scar tissue, into the stiff joints, explaining through the interpreter that it will help with the pain and stiffness, that she should apply it every night before bed. He can't undo the damage, he says, but he can make it more manageable. He wraps her hands in clean gauze, not tight, just enough to let the ointment soak in, and then he helps her put the gloves back on over the bandages. The gloves still fit, the leather soft against the gauze. He tells her to come back tomorrow so he can check the healing, to come back any time her hands hurt or if she notices any problems. He says this as if it's obvious, as if her pain matters, as if she deserves care. And that's when Greta breaks. The tears come suddenly, violently, great heaving sobs that shake her entire body. She bends forward, her bandaged hands pressed to her face, and cries with a desperation that frightens her. It's not just about the gloves or the ointment. It's about everything. It's about 3 years of being told that her suffering was noble, that her pain was necessary, that her damaged body was the price of duty. It's about the lie of it, the monstrous, casual lie that had normalized preventable suffering as patriotic sacrifice. It's about the realization that it didn't have to be that way. That someone somewhere had chosen to let her hands freeze and scar and stiffen, not because it was necessary, but because her comfort didn't matter, because she didn't matter. The medic looks alarmed and the interpreter tries to calm her, but Greta can't stop. The other prisoners have paused in their work, watching with expressions that range from concern to understanding. Some of them know. Some of them have their own scars, their own moments of realization. The sergeant approaches, his face creased with worry, and asks what's wrong. The interpreter explains haltingly about the hands, about the frostbite and scars, about the lack of treatment. The sergeant's expression hardens, and he says something in English that sounds like a curse. Then he tells the interpreter to make sure all the prisoners know that medical care is available, that they should report any injuries or health problems, that hiding pain is not expected or required here. Greta gradually regains control, the sobs subsiding into shaky breaths. She wipes her face with her sleeve, embarrassed by the breakdown, but the medic just pats her shoulder and hands her a handkerchief. He says something in English and the interpreter translates. He says you're safe now. He says it's okay to accept help. The words are so simple, so basic, but they land like a revelation. Safe. Help. Concepts that had been stripped from her vocabulary, from her reality, so gradually that she hadn't noticed their absence until they were offered again. She nods, unable to speak, and the medic smiles and sends her back to her workstation. The rest of the day passes in a blur. Greta works on repairing a broken engine mount, her hands clumsy in the unfamiliar gloves but protected, warm, safe. The ointment under the bandages makes the ache in her joints less sharp, and she finds herself flexing her fingers experimentally, testing the limits of movement. Around her, the workshop hums with activity. The other prisoners work steadily, and the American guards supervise without cruelty, occasionally offering advice or assistance. There's no screaming, no threats, no punishment for working too slowly. Just work, normal work, the kind that doesn't demand blood and suffering as proof of loyalty. At lunch, they're given sandwiches and soup, and Greta eats slowly, savoring each bite, still not quite believing that the food is real and plentiful. A woman sits beside her, an Italian POW named Lucia who'd been captured in North Africa. She notices Greta's bandaged hands and asks what happened. Greta explains haltingly, and Lucia nods with grim understanding. "They told us we were building a new world," Lucia says quietly. "They told us sacrifice was glory. But it was just cruelty dressed up as virtue." Greta thinks about this as she returns to work. Cruelty dressed as virtue. Yes, that's exactly what it had been. The normalization of suffering, the insistence that pain was noble, that endurance without complaint was the highest form of patriotism. And she'd believed it. They'd all believed it because what else could they do? To question it was to question everything, to admit that the suffering had been pointless, that the damage had been preventable, that they'd been used and discarded by a system that valued them less than the machines they maintained. The gloves on her hands are a constant reminder now. Every time she reaches for a tool, every time she feels the leather protecting her skin, she's confronted with the truth. It didn't have to be this way. It never had to be this way. That evening, back in the barracks, Greta sits on her bed and carefully removes the gloves and bandages as the medic instructed. Her hands look better already, the ointment having softened some of the tightness in the scars. She applies more salve, working it into her palms with slow, deliberate care, and the act feels almost sacred. Self-care. The concept is foreign, almost transgressive. For so long, caring for herself had seemed selfish, a betrayal of the collective effort. But here, now, it's expected, encouraged. The medic had seemed almost offended that her injuries had gone untreated, as if letting her suffer was the real betrayal. Around her, the other women are settling in for the night. Some are writing letters, even though they don't know if the letters will ever be sent. Some are talking quietly, sharing stories of their captures, their fears, their fragile hopes. One woman, a former signals operator named Hilda, approaches Greta's bed. She saw the breakdown in the workshop, heard about the gloves. "I had frostbite too," Hilda says softly, holding out her own hands. 2 fingers on her right hand are shortened, the tips missing. They amputated them in a field hospital, no anesthetic. Told me I was lucky they didn't take the whole hand. She sits beside Greta, and they compare scars in the dim light. 2 women marked by a system that had ground them down and called it duty. "But we're here now," Hilda says, "and they're treating us like people." "I don't understand it, but I'm not going to question it." Greta nods slowly. She doesn't understand it either. The Americans are supposed to be the enemy, the barbaric monsters from the propaganda films. But the reality is so different from what she'd been taught that it's disorienting. The food is good. The barracks are warm. The medical care is available. The work is reasonable, and they gave her gloves. Such a small thing, really, just gloves. But in that small gesture is contained a fundamental difference in philosophy, in how human beings are valued and treated. Her regime had taught her that suffering was strength, that deprivation built character, that true patriots endured without complaint. But here, preventing suffering is just common sense. Protecting workers is practical. Treating injuries is expected. The contrast is so stark it's almost incomprehensible. Over the following days, Greta settles into a routine. She works in the workshop each morning, her hands growing stronger and more flexible as the ointment and protection do their work. The medic checks on her regularly, pleased with the healing, and eventually clears her to work without bandages, though she still applies the salve each night. The gloves become her most prized possession. She keeps them carefully, treating them with a reverence that would seem absurd if anyone didn't understand the weight they carry. They're not just gloves. They're proof that she matters, that her pain matters, that she deserves protection. Other prisoners notice the change in her. She's not alone in her realization. Many of them are grappling with similar revelations, confronting the gap between what they'd been taught and what they're experiencing. The cognitive dissonance is painful, but necessary. One afternoon in early March, a new group of German POWs arrives at the camp, freshly captured from the collapsing Western Front. They're in worse shape than Greta's group had been, more malnourished, more traumatized. Among them is a young woman, barely 20, who'd been a mechanic like Greta. Her hands are wrapped in filthy rags, and when the rags are removed during processing, her palms are a mess of infected cuts and frostbite damage. The medic treats her immediately, and Greta watches from across the room as the young woman receives the same care she had, the same ointment, the same bandages. And when the sergeant distributes work gloves the next day, the young woman breaks down just as Greta had, sobbing into her hands as the reality of kindness overwhelms her. Greta approaches her later in the barracks and sits beside her. "I know," she says quietly, "I know what you're feeling." The young woman looks up, her eyes red and swollen. "They gave me gloves," she whispers, "like I'm worth something." "You are worth something," Greta says, and the words feel true in a way they never had before. "We all are. That's what they're trying to show us. That's what we forgot." The young woman nods, clutching her gloves like a lifeline, and Greta sees herself reflected in that desperate grip. They sit together in silence, two women learning to accept that they deserve care, that their suffering was never noble, that the system that had damaged them had been wrong. It's a hard lesson. It means confronting the lies they'd believed, the sacrifices they'd made for a cause that had never valued them. It means accepting that they'd been used, that their pain had been preventable, that someone had chosen to let them suffer. But it also means healing. Slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. As winter turns to spring, Greta's hands continue to improve. The stiffness lessens, though it never fully disappears. The scars remain, permanent reminders of what she endured. But the pain is manageable now, and she can work without the constant ache that had been her companion for so long. She writes a letter to her mother, not knowing if it will ever arrive, but needing to put words to her experience. "I am safe," she writes. "I am being treated well. They gave me gloves, Mama. Such a small thing, but it means everything. It means I matter. It means my pain matters. I wish I had understood that sooner. I wish we all had." The letter is collected by the camp administration to be sent through the Red Cross if possible. Greta doesn't know if her mother is even alive, if their home in Hamburg still stands, if there will be anything to return to when the war finally ends. But she knows that she's changed. That she can never go back to believing the lies that had sustained her through those brutal years. In May, news reaches the camp that Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. The prisoners gather in the mess hall to hear the announcement, and the reaction is complicated. Relief, certainly. The killing has stopped, but also grief for all that was lost and fear for what comes next. Will they be sent home? Will there be homes to return to? What awaits them in a defeated, occupied Germany? Greta sits with her hands folded in her lap, her work gloves resting beside her plate. She thinks about the future, about rebuilding, about learning to live in a world where the lies have been exposed and the truth is painful but necessary. She thinks about the gloves and what they represent. Not just protection for her hands, but a fundamental shift in how she understands her own worth. She'd been taught that her value lay in her willingness to suffer, to sacrifice, to endure without complaint. But that was never true. Her value is inherent, not earned through pain. She deserves care, deserves protection, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. It took becoming a prisoner to learn that. It took an enemy showing her more kindness than her own leaders ever had. The irony is bitter, but the lesson is real. That evening, she applies ointment to her hands one more time, working it into the scars that will never fully fade. Her fingers are stronger now, more flexible, though they'll never be what they were before the war. The damage is permanent, a physical record of the years she spent believing that suffering was strength. But she's learning to live with it. Learning to accept that the scars are not badges of honor, but evidence of a system that failed her. Learning that healing is not weakness, but the most courageous thing she can do. She pulls on her gloves, feeling the familiar comfort of the leather, and allows herself a small smile. Tomorrow, she'll return to the workshop. She'll continue to work, to heal, to slowly rebuild a sense of self that isn't based on sacrifice and suffering. And she'll remember always the moment when an American medic handed her ointment and gloves and explained that preventing injury was simply common sense. Because in that moment, everything changed. In that moment, she began to understand that she'd been lied to, that her pain had been unnecessary, that she deserved better. And that understanding, painful as it is the first step toward becoming whole again. The gloves are just gloves. But they're also proof that another way is possible. That kindness is not weakness. That caring for people, even prisoners, even enemies, is not just practical but morally right. It's a lesson her own regime never learned, and it cost them everything. But she's learned it now, and she'll carry it with her, along with her scars, into whatever future awaits, because some truths once learned can never be unlearned. And some acts of kindness, however small, can change everything.